Hi, in this lesson, I want to talk about the concept of texture. And texture is kind of interesting because you can experience it through two different senses. Unlike color, which you have to see it to understand it. For example, you can't smell the color blue. You can't hear the color blue. You can't feel the color blue. In order to understand blue, you have to see it. Texture, on the other hand, can be experienced both through the sense of touch and through your sense of vision. So in this lesson, I want you to be able to understand what the concept of texture is. I want you to understand the different ways of describing texture, and I would like you to be able to describe a work of art with regards to the textures that are being used. First, we have actual texture, then visual texture, real texture, and artificial texture. What are the differences between these? Well, actual texture is the way something feels to your sense of touch. If you were to walk up to a tree, close your eyes, and touch the bark, you'd be able to experience how that bark felt, the texture of it. You'd understand the bumpiness of it, the roughness of it. You could describe the texture of that tree, even with your eyes closed, just through your sense of touch. This is the actual texture. Now, artists will use actual textures in their work. Van Gogh was known for this. He would apply the paint so heavy and so aggressively that if you were to touch one of his paintings, you could feel the direction of his brushstroke. Now, that doesn't mean you could experience the color or the intensity of the yellows and the reds and the oranges, but you would be able to experience the intensity of his brushstroke. That is the actual texture. Artists will oftentimes try to create the illusion of texture. For example, on this screen, you see 3 squares, each representing a different texture. The first, again, is tree bark. It looks rough, it looks bumpy. The middle square also looks bumpy, but a little smoother. These are not actual textures. If you were to touch the screen right now, it would feel rather smooth. Your eyes are telling you something different than your sense of touch. This is a visual texture. It needs to be seen to be understood. Artists who work in the realistic style try to imitate the real world by creating visual illusions of texture. When you look at this painting, it looks like a wet leaf. It looks like you could touch it and feel the water droplets. That is an example of a visual texture, art simulating the real world. In this painting, you can see the artist's successful simulation of a soap bubble. It appears wet. It appears shiny. It appears as if you could reach out and poke it with your finger and it would pop. That's a visual illusion, a visual texture created through the skill of the artist. If you look really close, you could see the actual texture of the brushstroke. But the actual texture is much different than the visual illusion that is created. So how does this differ from a real texture? Well, here's an image of a rabbit. A rabbit exists in the real world. The artist attempted to capture that texture with a visual illusion of the fur. So it's a real texture, but it's a visual illusion, a visual texture. It's both real and visual. It is not an actual texture. If you were to reach out and touch it, it would not feel like fur. This, on the other hand, is an artificial texture. Van Gogh, again, created this painting, a self-portrait of himself. The air around him is filled with swirls and aggressive, thick brush strokes so that if you were to reach out and touch it, you could feel the swirling brush strokes going around him. This again is an actual texture. You can feel it. But it is not a real texture because air does not in reality feel like that. That is not the real texture of air. Van Gogh created this out of his own imagination. When an artist creates a texture from their imagination, something outside the real world, we would call this an artificial texture. So in review, an actual texture is something you experience through your sense of touch. A visual texture is an illusion that you experience through your sense of vision. A real texture is something that exists in the real world. And an artificial texture is something that is created from the artist's imagination. So you can have a real texture that is actual or visual. A leaf exists in the real world. So these are both real images of real things, real textures. The one on the left is the actual wet leaf that someone is touching. The one on the right is a visual illusion. So the left is a real actual texture. The one on the right is a real visual texture. In these two images, the one on the left is an actual texture, a close-up of one of Van Gogh's paintings. It is not a real texture. It is something the artist invented from his imagination. So it's an artificial, actual texture. The one on the right is a visual illusion. Again, something the artist created from his imagination. It is an artificial visual texture. In the PowerPoint that follows, I want you to look at how artists use textures differently. I'm going to give you a project at the end of that PowerPoint. We'll have more detail on the expectations. Thank you.